Good afternoon, everyone. Like Lauren said, welcome back to our summer 2024 workshops. My name is Tom Seekert, and I am the Procurement Accessibility Specialist here at the Accessibility Center. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about integrating accessibility into your ICT procurement processes. Just wanted to give a little bit about my background. I've spent a little more than 21 years in higher education so far. 17 of those years actually worked in a procurement office, and starting out first as a senior IT buyer, and then I later moved on to a contracting officer and then a procurement program manager. And then 10 of those years, I was an invited subject matter expert to what's known as the CSU Accessible Technology Network. And this is basically a group of subject matter experts that the CSU Office of the Chancellor brought together to work on initiatives to get the campus perspective for things on behalf of the entire the CSU system. And I'm going to be talking about a number of the things that we learned in relation to this presentation today. So just an overview of the topics we're going to go into. Overall is talking about integrating accessibility into your ICT procurement processes. Just a quick note, something that you'll hear me say and a number of my colleagues will say is that when you're working with accessibility and trying to integrate it into your organization and your processes, it's really never about, creating standalone accessibility processes, because that just kind of doesn't work and it's not sustainable. What we are talking about and what we recommend is that you find ways to implement and integrate accessibility considerations into the various processes that you're already doing or are planning to be doing. So along those lines, we have it broken out into three main areas or ways or opportunities to integrate accessibility into the procurement processes. The first is your pre-purchase processes that you have typically for IT more generally. And then we're going to look at the accessibility evaluation processes themselves. Then lastly, we're going to talk about the actual procurement processes where you're contracting with vendors, working with vendors, et cetera. And one of the other main focuses of this presentation is that I'm going to be offering a number of real-world examples and best practices to hopefully, if you haven't started on some of these things that I'm going to show you, kind of give you some food for thought and give you some examples so it's more concrete and kind of kickstart your ideas and brainstorming for what you might do at your particular college. So from the get-go, I'm going to be using the term ICT, or Information and Communication Technology, throughout this presentation. Just wanted to define that and give you an idea of what we're talking about to give it the context. A lot of people are more familiar with the larger term, which is information technology or just technology. Information and communication technology is a subset within IT or technology. And specifically, it refers to technologies that allow users to share, gather, process, and communicate, operative word here, information. So one of the ways you would know if something is categorized as ICT or not is whether it has a user interface. So the things that are ICT all allow for users to directly interact with the technologies. So there's three main categories when we're talking about ICT. So you have hardware, and this is anything from computers and laptops to multifunction copiers to self-service machines to interactive kiosks and perhaps interactive digital signage. Next, we have software, and this ranges anything from the programs that you would install onto a computer, for example, to the more common nowadays, the web and mobile applications that are pretty much everywhere, to also things like the learning management systems like Canvas that we use, all of the integrated tools within there, our online collaboration tools, our virtual meeting tools, et cetera. And then lastly, this is kind of a new addition with the 2017 refresh of Section 508 that was mentioned a little earlier in the workshops today. And this is digital content. So first and foremost, things like email. Everyone sends emails. Those need to be accessible. The digital files that you are creating and working with, such as Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, the ever-present and pesky Adobe PDFs, audio and podcast, videos, web pages, social media content, and the platforms. So the other thing to note is that any technology that falls within this category of ICT, these are the technologies that are required through the federal laws and others, state laws too, Section 508 most principally, that requires us in the CCC to ensure that we're following the accessibility requirements and the standards that are defined within Section 508 for any of the technology, whether we develop it, whether we're using it, whether we maintain it, or the focus of this presentation, whether we procure that technology. Okay. Next, I want to talk about it's really important when we're looking at creating processes to make sure that whatever processes that we create or we update them, we need to make sure that we're accomplishing the main objectives. What are we trying to accomplish? So when you're talking about accessibility and ICT and procurement, there's three main objectives. These are the things that we need to always be focusing on as we develop our processes. The first and principal one is we need to work to identify real world, actual accessibility barriers and find out how these barriers will impact our end users. Second objective is we need to be working with our vendors collaboratively to improve the accessibility of the products that we're using and buying for our colleges. So we need to be working with the developers and the vendors to share the information that we gathered from the objective one about, okay, what are the barriers that we've been able to identify, and get some sort of commitment from them to move things forward and to make more accessible products over time. The third objective is related to the others, and this goes back to Section 508, the federal law, and its requirements in that while we are able to follow Section 508, comply with the law, and buy partially accessible technologies, what we are required to do, because we know there's barriers, is also proactively plan for, well, how would we provide equally effective alternative access as kind of a bridge? So it enables any of our current users that are unable to use the partially accessible technologies that we buy, it enables them to receive access. It might not be in exactly the same way, but it allows them to achieve the same learning objectives, receive the same information, and participate as equally as users without a disability. So those are the three main objectives. It's really important to keep those in mind. So as I mentioned at the start, I plan to talk about a number of real world examples and best practices. So going back a little bit, part of the work that I did for the CSU Accessible Technology Network that I mentioned at the beginning was I led an effort to create a standardized way for, in the case of the CSU, all of the colleges having a common approach or framework, as we called it, for how we're going to address accessibility during the procurement of ICT. So my colleagues and I came up with a standardized framework that we thought, okay, we think this will work. And basically what it consisted of was four overall steps. The first being gathering product and accessibility information about something that's under consideration for purchasing. The second step was to then review that information and select, okay, what's the most appropriate review activities? The third step was the accessibility validation itself. And this is where you kind of compare what the vendor might be telling you versus what you're able to discover perhaps is the more realistic user experience that our users will be faced with these products. And then lastly, the fourth step was to complete the procurement steps, working with vendors and making sure they follow any accessibility requirements that would be determined during the process. So this framework is what we came up with as a group. What the Office of the Chancellor decided at that point was, okay, we have what we think will work. Will this actually work once we get to a college and try to implement it in the real world? So we decided to launch this pilot, kind of a proof of concept at my university at Fresno State. And so next I'll kind of go into kind of what happened during that pilot. Okay, and again, this is a real world example. When we first started, there was a lot of things we didn't know. So I was in a procurement role. I was responsible for procuring all of IT items for the campus. I would receive paper requisitions. That was back in the day where that's how we received orders from people wanting to buy things. And when I first started, I was trying to figure out, well, how do I assess this potential purchase for accessibility? And it was a big challenge because the documentation that I received or the purchase requisitions was missing all of the key information that I needed to do a proper review. So what that means is there was no information about the accessibility levels of the product under consideration. Now, typically, the way that you get that information is through what's known as an accessibility conformance report, or some people still kind of know it by its old name, which is a VPAT or voluntary product accessibility template. So the paperwork that I received didn't have any of that information included with it. The other thing that was missing was there was no information really about what's the purpose of this technology, what are the features that we're going to implement, who are the users, how many, etc. It was all kind of by deduction to try to figure out the information because it just wasn't there. Another thing that we learned quickly is that we had a number of ad hoc processes related to what we called an IT or just technology review. So this was existing before we tried to add accessibility into it. So what that meant was we in procurement, we were designated as a gatekeeper, and we were supposed to be making sure that any technology purchases that we had first checked with the support rep for the area, made sure they were okay with the purchase. We were supposed to check with information security officer if there was any confidential or protected data. And if there was any college-wide technologies being deployed, we were supposed to make sure that our central IT group knew about it and was on board with it. So overall, and then I added the accessibility piece on top of that, right? So a potential purchase, I would potentially be reaching out to an end user or purchase requisitioner and asking them, can you tell me about the accessibility of this product? So a lot of duplication of efforts. Users were really kind of confused who's asking what. And users really kind of had no visibility about, well, what's the status of my order? I just want this technology. The next thing we quickly figured out was there was an overwhelming number of technology purchases being made. In any given year, we looked through the data and there was about 1,200 purchases per year on average. That's 100 a month. And related to the next point, I already had a full-time job and the accessibility evaluation part was kind of other duties as assigned. So I really couldn't take on reviewing 100 purchases per month. That just wouldn't work given I already had a full-time job. So that kind of sets the context, what we learned at the beginning. So we learned a number of lessons from that. First of all, we needed a way to collect that key information, that missing information that I just spoke about, including the accessibility documentation from the vendors. We also needed a way to triage purchases to better focus our efforts, meaning we needed a way to figure out, okay, what's most important and what's really not so important so that we could better focus our very limited resources on what's important. And that's related to the last lesson learned is that, if we really wanted to do a meaningful review for accessibility, it really requires a dedicated accessibility reviewer. So next, I'm going to go into kind of each of those three areas that I mentioned at the beginning. And the pre-purchase process is there's three things that we need to do related to accessibility and ICT. The first is we need to collect that accessibility documentation. That's your accessibility conformance report or VPAT. Second is it's really critical to know and to gather upfront what is the product, how's it going to be used, who are the users, how many, etc. And then lastly, we need to be able to determine the risk of what we're looking at and select the review activities accordingly. So that's all of these things are the things that we need to do. The focus of this presentation is on the how, right? So how do you do that? How do you operationalize this? So the first is a college needs to require a pre-approval for all ICT procurements or adoptions. For determining risk and selecting which review activities that need to be done, this is, as I mentioned, one of the lessons learned is you really need to, if you're going to do meaningful reviews, assign someone to serve in the role of an accessibility reviewer. So getting into, requiring that pre-approval for all ICT procurements or adoptions. So the first step, the foundational step is the college needs to establish a process that requires that review and pre-approval before any ICT procurement or adoption can proceed. Once you have that foundational step in place, the next step is you need to develop that means of collecting information for the accessibility reviewer. And in the case of the pilot that I was talking about before, we developed what we called an IT purchase review form. And this web form collected that, allowed the purchase requisition, the person that's looking to buy something, to enter the product information, to describe how something's going to be used, describe who the users are, etc. And then it also provided a way for that same person to upload the ACR or the VPAT from the vendor at the time that they're submitting the purchase for review. So on the screen now is a kind of a screenshot that shows all of the various pieces of key information that you would want to have on such a form. So in this case, that includes information about who's the purchase requester, contact information for the vendor that you plan to use, information about the procurement itself, whether it's going to be a PO, is this a contract, is this a piggybackable contract, for example, is it, say, a Cal card, or perhaps is there no payment required in the case of something that's free or donation or something like that. The form then asks for, how much does it cost? What's the term of the agreement? So is this a one-time purchase or is this a multi-year agreement? And then the review type. So is this a first-time purchase? So for this particular technology, is this the first time someone is buying it at the college, or is this a repeat of something someone has already bought? Or is this a renewal, which is more often in the case of, say, a software subscription? And then we get into all the information that's really so critical and so often missing is, okay, what is the product? Perhaps, what version or release number? Is there a website that you can have the reviewer go look at? And then the really critical piece and the intended use. How is this product intended to be used? What are the key features that you plan to implement? And how do users interact with this technology? Next is, okay, what types of users do you have? Are there students? Are there faculty? Are there the public? Are staff going to use this? And then if you check the box for any one of those user types, the form would then ask you, well, how many? How many users do you anticipate you would have in, an annual basis for this technology? The next group of questions is related to, okay, what category of technology is this? Is this software, or is this a website, a web application, perhaps a cloud-based product, or is this digital content or services, or is this or is this hardware or electronic equipment? And then there was an other to kind of catch things that didn't neatly fit into those categories. The next key question is, well, where can this technology be accessed from? Is it a non-public location, such as an office or a restricted area? Is it a public location, such as a lab or a classroom environment? Or is this technology accessed from a web-based, is it web-based and it can be accessed from any device, anywhere, anytime? The next question is related to required usage. So this question is this technology required to be used for an academic or student-related purpose? And or is it related to college or a job related purpose, or is use just completely optional? And then the last, we have just a number of other questions. Future uses, and this is just as a side note, this is kind of condensed compared to what the version that we deployed actually had, the verbiage. This is pared down just for demonstration and for the screen. So this is referring to perhaps those situations where people bought a pilot, they bought 5 licenses. But what you didn't necessarily know was that same requester might plan to roll it out to the entire college or the entire department. So this is around that question. The next one was around protected or confidential data. Does this technology store or transmit protected or confidential data? And the last one was, does this technology need any college IT support of any kind? So the other thing I wanted to mention is this form was set up to be dynamic. And in the case of the pilot, in my case, um, the technology, the IT group at the college wanted to solve a number of other additional challenges in addition to accessibility at the same time. So that's why the last few questions are related to things like information security and cybersecurity. And basically, if you selected yes for any of these last questions, the form would then ask you a number of follow-up questions. So basically, it was a dynamic form, and if it needed more information, it then showed you additional fields. And then lastly, we also built in some workflows for approval behind this form. So when you're looking at implementing something like this at a college level, you can make it as simple as this is just about accessibility, right? And so the approver would be just to one person. But if you wanted to take on some of these other challenges as well, such as cybersecurity, et cetera, you could build in more complexity to kind of help with that and add additional approvers. So you can make it as simple or as complex. The point for the end user is they fill out one form, they submit it once, and the reviews that need to happen just take place behind the scenes, and it solves a lot of problems for people. So why are we asking for the information that's on the IT purchase request form that I just showed you? One of the main purposes is that we're trying to get a sense of the context. What is it that we're looking at? And assess the information that's there amongst a number of risk factors to come up with, best determination of, okay, that this purchase represents a high risk or this purchase represents a lower or low risk. So part of why that's important is you also use that risk level to determine your accessibility review activities, which is both what you do and it's also what you don't do, right? In the case of things that are lower risk, you don't do a number of things that you would have otherwise done if something were high risk. So that's kind of the purpose. So just quickly, a quick overview of this. When you're looking at risk factors, you're looking at things like criticality. Is what the end user is describing a critical service or program? And contrast that with, say, a low risk. Is it an optional service or program? Next factor is the audience size. Is it a large audience, moderate, or a small audience? Next risk factor is student or public facing. If something is student or public facing, as you can tell, and it's high kind of by definition, and the others are less so. Anything that's high risk represents a significant legal exposure, and moderate or little or none as for the different risk levels. And then the next risk factor is assessing, okay, if there is a barrier that's presented by the technology that we're looking to get, it becomes high risk if that denies access to groups of people with disabilities, versus moderate risk if it limits the access, versus if it doesn't limit access, it's more of a bad user experience, then that's a lower risk. The next factor is, are the barriers recurring? So what that means is, on the form it asks for, is this a single purchase or a multi-year purchase, for example? Things that are for multiple years represent a higher risk because they're going to be a recurring use over a longer period of time, versus say low risk, which is non-recurring. These are things that are used once or perhaps for a very limited time. And then lastly is just the overall likelihood of impacting users with disabilities. If it's high, that represents a high risk factor. So next we want to go through two examples to kind of illustrate, and this is one where the audience, I want you to kind of participate here. The first example that we're going to analyze together is a Title IX, All Rise Title IX training, right? This is a web-based mandatory training that is a legal, the training is to meet a legal requirement for the Violence Against Women Act and the Campus Safe Act. It's a required use for all students to complete it, and a registration hold is placed on any student that can't complete it within a timely manner. And lastly, topics covered may be traumatic for anyone who's already been a victim of trauma or assault. So that gives you kind of the context of what this technology is, how is it going to be used. There are, in this example, 9,500 student users. And let me just say, this is for a college in this example that has 9,500 students. So all students have to use it. This is a web application. It can be accessed from the web from any device, anywhere. It is required for a student-related purpose. And there's potentially protected or confidential data depending on the solution and what information it gathers. And it needs central IT support. So also critical to note, this is a contract. It's $95,000. It's multiple years. And this is the first time that we're buying it. So at this point, I would like you to determine the risk level and put your answers in the chat. Is it high, moderate? And I think I messed up there and I showed you the answer ahead of time. That's correct. It is high. Okay, next we're going to go to example number 2. Okay, in this example, this is Parallels Desktop for the Mac. This is the Windows Virtual Desktop software. It's going to be installed on one faculty member's laptop for their use only, just to run various applications. And it's used within their office, a restricted environment, and use is completely optional. It's $99. It's a single use. What do you think the risk level is for this? Is it high, moderate, or low? And if I could count on my colleagues to let me know what's the most common response in the chat.
Low.
Yes, exactly. So this is a great example of a low impact. It only impacts that single user. There's no probability of impacting anyone else, especially users with disabilities. In the first example that we had, obviously, let me go back real quick. In the first example that we had 9,500 students. That has a very high likelihood of impacting students with disabilities. As we learned earlier today, only 5% of students with disabilities are registered with the Disability Services Office. So there's a large number that don't receive services from disability services, and they're very likely to be impacted by a solution such as this. Okay, next we're going to get into, okay, what do you do with that information, right? So this is another best practice. This is what we call a risk matrix. And in this matrix, it lists 6 possible types of accessibility review activities that the campus or the college could do. And based upon the different risk levels, it defines what the campus will do. So in other words, I'll start with the low risk first of the software that we talked about, the Parallels desktop. Using this matrix, it would tell you it's low risk. We're going to request an ACR from a vendor, and we're going to ensure that there's an accessibility clause in the PO or contract. And that's it. We're not going to do any of the other 4 possible review activities. However, going back to the first example, because of its high risk, we're going to request that accessibility conformance report from the vendor. We're going to perform a review, a critical review of that documentation. We're going to require the vendor to provide a live product accessibility demo. We're going to create what's known as an equally effective alternative access plan. We are going to also require that an accessibility clause be included in the PO or contract. And lastly, we're going to work with the vendor to have them commit to what's known as an accessibility roadmap, in which the vendor agrees to fix the barriers in a defined period of time. So one other quick thing to note here is that this is something that's kind of a living document that the college can update and kind of change based upon your capabilities and your maturity levels. So as you have more resources, you can choose to do more things. For, say, perhaps things that are optional for moderate risk, you might take those on as you have more resources. So next, we want to get into the actual accessibility evaluation processes. So for these processes, we have 3 main things that we need to be doing. First is we need to identify those real-world accessibility barriers. Second is we need to work with our vendors and developers to obtain a commitment to fix those barriers, to remediate those barriers, to make their products more accessible. And lastly, and just as critically, we need to share results of all of our accessibility evaluation work with key stakeholders. So that's the what we need to do. Next, we're going to focus on the how. So for identifying real-world accessibility barriers, it's all about validation. Something that you'll hear often from us is that it's kind of the whole trust but verify. You can't really take a vendor's word. And Esther, give me 1 second and I'll get to you. You can't take a vendor's word for what they say the accessibility experience or user experience will be. You really need to use different types of accessibility validation techniques. Esther, did you have a question?
I will type it in the chat.
Great, thanks. And if I could ask one of my colleagues to read the chat, just because I'm on a small screen, so I'm challenged to see everything that's going on.
There was a question a couple of slides back about a template for the review. They were wondering if it was available as a template.
A template for what to review or how to review the information?
Yeah, that review.
On the form?
Mm-hmm.
Not yet, but that's something that's kind of in the works that would kind of go into kind of each of the elements. Like each element that's collected and how you would evaluate it, that's something that is kind of planned as far as providing a resource for how to do that. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, the form that you had shared, yes.
Yeah, Tom, I think they're specifically referring to the form that you shared as an example.
Right. So, I mean, this doesn't help you yet, but in my mind, I am already picturing where we will highlight different elements and then kind of talk about, how you would evaluate that and what it would mean towards, coming to an overall risk assessment. So kind of tying in the elements so you know what to be looking at and how to evaluate it is what's planned for the resource. Was there another question as well?
No, it's been answered in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, the next way that we do this as far as obtaining the commitment to remediate barriers is having a collaborative, non-adversarial relationship with vendors, right? I mean, going way back is kind of, there was too much kind of what I would say is, it was very adversarial and confrontational. The way that you really make progress is to openly share, collaborate, be willing to provide information. So if, for example, the college is evaluating an accessibility conformance report, share those findings with them, right? That helps them become better educated, and it also helps them, it makes them more likely to agree to fixing the barriers that you actually come up with. The other thing is when you show a vendor in a live demo in front of, say, the college, the barriers, that kind of puts a pressure just kind of naturally for them to want to fix, what was shown to be an issue for the users. Okay, now the how for the sharing results, and this is really, really critical. So, and this is often where you see some of the biggest gaps, where you'll have colleges that have perhaps really, really good evaluation processes, but where the gap is that the end users with a disability, they don't know about that information, right? So it's really critical, and the primary way that we share that is through accessibility statements, linked from, say, inside of an application or perhaps from a web page that lets the user know intuitively, easily, without having to go look anywhere, that, oh, there's these known accessibility barriers. Here's any known workarounds. Here's any known alternative means of access. And oh, here's where I get help if I'm stuck. Perhaps there's an accessibility help desk at that vendor, for example. That's where all that information should live, so that your end users have a chance to know and to get help and to have that information be helpful to them. That's really critical. The other way is what I refer to kind of just generically is having document repositories. So there's a number of ways you could do this, but the concept is that you need a place that you train the college staff to know that any faculty or staff can go to this repository and find information. Okay, it's this technology. Oh yeah, here's the accessibility evaluation. Here's the barriers that were found. Here's the resources that are related to it. And this can be really critical because, again, some of those gaps are the frontline workers, whether it's in human resources, whether it's in IT help desk, whether it's in disability services, they're the ones that very often are the people that are on the front lines talking to the users that might be impacted by a barrier. So it's really critical your staff know where they can go look and, oh, here's the information. It's right here. We know there's these issues, and direct your users promptly and quickly and get a better resolution for them. So I talked about it's really critical to validate accessibility conformance. So at the end of the day, I've listed now actually 7 different ways to validate accessibility, the real world accessibility of a product that you're looking at. These are ways to surface that, what is the user experience likely to be? So the first, and I alluded to this just briefly earlier, and that is when you have a ACR or VPAT, it's important not to just, have a checkbox. Okay, we received a VPAT, we're good. It's far more valuable to critically review that. And we have micro courses coming that are directly on this topic that train you on, as a college or as an accessibility reviewer, how I can review this information a vendor's providing and provide feedback and perhaps get to learn what are actual barriers in this technology. You can use automated testing, anything from Pope Tech that we provide to a number of free browser tools, etc. You can do a live vendor product accessibility demo. We plug this every chance we get. This is where you require a vendor to do a demo of their product that you're looking to get, show you all the main features or functionality that you're looking to get, but needs to be live, not recorded, and it needs to follow a script that you provide, where it's not just them doing their shiny, dog and pony show where they show you whatever. It's that you show those key features, but do it using assistive technology such as using a screen reader or without your mouse, or perhaps zooming it to 200%, etc., and showing live what that user experience is likely to be. You can do manual testing with assistive technologies if you have the capacity and the capability. The newest one that I've added here is you can do what's known as the DHS, Department of Homeland Security Trusted Tester testing methodology. And basically, this is a manual code inspection to where you're objectively looking at, kind of behind, looking at the code and determining if it's compliant or not. So that's it's a free resource. It takes more than 100 hours to get the certification, but it's invaluable if you have the resources to invest that time, and you can provide actionable, actual, here's the barrier in the code level to a developer or a vendor. And that makes it far more likely that they then might actually fix it. You can also do user testing, of course, making sure to include users with disabilities. Then lastly, this is typically reserved for things that are, say a district-wide. You could have a third-party expert level accessibility audit, which will give you reliable, trustable results. So the last part is we're going to go into the actual procurement processes themselves. And the what is, we need to integrate a requirement for an accessibility review into any procurements that we do. So the way you do it is all the different ways that technology can be procured or adopted. Make sure that there's a requirement for this accessibility review that I've been talking about in the pre-purchase processes and then the evaluations. So this is the whole thing. So you require the accessibility review for all the different methods of ICT procurement or adoption. And there's many, as you know, there's many different ways that technology comes onto our colleges. So the first category are things that we just procure with our normal procurement processes. So perhaps we place an order, there's no bids required. We just generate a purchase order, et cetera, at a college level. Or perhaps a bidding is required, perhaps it's an informal bid, or perhaps it's a district bid where it has to go before the board and it requires a request for proposal. But in both of those examples, you just need to make sure that any of those procurement processes, make sure that you update those procedures so that within that, the accessibility review is a required component of that. The next thing is related to, and this is especially critical on the CCC, the California Community Colleges, is a number of our purchases in the system use what's known as leveraged purchase contracts or collaborative purchasing agreements. So these are things such as the state of California has what's known as CMAS. You have nationally bid contracts such as NASPO, and we have college buys, and we have a number of other ones within the CCC where perhaps you as a college aren't doing any bidding, but there's this contract that you can use. So the point here is you need to make sure that even if you're using that contract, which you can use, that you have a local accessibility review to make sure all those things have been covered. Related to that, you have things where it's kind of the same way where you can use an online catalog, or these are called e-procurement solutions typically. So perhaps you have Amazon Business, where you have a catalog that anyone at your college can go in, place orders. Perhaps it's Staples for office supplies, et cetera. Perhaps, for technology too. You need to make sure that, wherever you have training or procedures in regards to using those type of catalogs, that there's a clearly defined requirement to have an accessibility review first to pre-approve that purchase if it's something that's ICT. Next, we're looking at, well, it needs to be regardless of funding source. So there's a number of situations where you either have special funds or donation funds or third-party funds. You need to make it clear because it's not usually the case, but those need to follow the same campus processes as well. So you need to make sure wherever you talk about those type of purchases or adoptions, that you add this requirement in there too. So that includes anything that's free or no cost, as I mentioned, donations as well. Then the last piece of that is payment method is also a thing too, where certain users have Cal cards, credit cards that they have the ability to place orders directly without going through any sort of procurement process per se. So the way to do that here is make sure that your CalCard manual or what have you describes a requirement to get a pre-approval before that might be an allowable use of the CalCard to buy that technology. And with that, we've come to the questions.
Okay, I have a question that was sent to me directly. What is the best way to let faculty and staff know about the new pre-purchase processes that are put in place, that they put in place?
Right, great question. Thanks, Lauren. So training. So wherever you would have training that relates to these topics. So if you do, say, procurement might have a training for Procurement 101 or something related to that. Make sure whenever you're talking about the requirements for technology purchases, you talk about your new system and that you have a pre-purchase requirement. In the context of, say, academic technologies, perhaps you have a process for adopting new technologies. Perhaps you do training there and you say, oh, by the way, we have this new process for these type of procurements that need to go through a pre-approval process.
And it looks like in the chat, do you have materials that have already been made as examples for any of these? So I'm assuming like the forms or any type of documents you're talking about.
Sorry, was that for training materials?
Andrea? Oh, yes.
Don't have examples yet, although we're working on a number of trainings related to procurement process. So that might cover that. Also forms. So I would anticipate that some of our training might go into the forms and, for example, might include some of the things I talked about today as far as what types of information do you want to collect and then what would you do with that? I don't know if, what would you do with that information? How does it affect the process? If that answers your question, Andrea. Great. So the other question, I'm just going to go in order here. Jennifer, does the CCC already have a list of technology that's already been through the ACR? And the answer is, to my knowledge, no. To my knowledge, there's no centralized either just a repository kind of generally for the ACRs, or the more value would be something where it's information about kind of the review process, right? My colleagues and I are very familiar with, a number of us came from the CSU, and I think they're on their 4th iteration of what they call a VPAT database or repository. So it's not that it doesn't have a value, but part of what's challenging is making sure that it's curated, making sure it's up to date for it to have value for people, if that makes sense. And to the point of, would it be possible for the CCCO to create a database of accessible software and EAPS? So what I would say is, and I would defer to Dawn about, what can be done, but what makes a repository valuable is curation and information beyond just the documentation. So EAPS, if they're well thought out, can be valuable. Anything about the accessibility evaluation and what was found, that could be more valuable than just the ACRs themselves. It's kind of the analysis of it where the value is gained, the biggest value. And I love the last question that came in. I don't want to miss the others before I answer that one. Um,
There was one about the HECVAT also.
yeah, I didn't want to miss that one either. Okay, so thanks, Lauren, helping me wade through the comments. The HECVAT is more, so my opinion on the HECVAT is it's more related to information security, although it does have accessibility related questions in it. So there's kind of a little overlap with the ACR or VPAT. The information there is more what I would say more open-ended type of things. But whether you're using an ACR or whether you're looking at a HECVAT, I would say that the same thing still applies, is that you need to analyze what's in there. And a lot of times you need to do other things to validate the information that the vendor provides, whether it's, communicating with the vendor, doing some sort of demo, having some sort of interactive process back and forth. I don't think in either case you can take what they say at face value, not that they're trying to mislead per se, but I don't think it has value until you kind of vet it and have that interactive process to validate it. There was a comment, it'd be great if the chancellor's office is able to vet a number of popular products desired by numerous colleges and create a list of those that are readily accessible and relieve the duplication of efforts. I would defer that comment to Dawn if Dawn wanted to comment on that one.
I will say is that we're running out of time, and we are seriously looking at many different topics. We are working with system-wide chancellor's office. The challenge with creating a list of products that are considered accessible is we have 117 colleges using products 117 different ways. So therefore, what might be in one college acceptable because of the use case and considered accessible enough is not necessarily going to be the case in another college. And so therefore, and in Tom's longer presentations, he tells you that that's the wrong question to ask. And that instead it's about how accessible is it based off of your use cases. But there are things that we can and are working with system-wide chancellor's office on to try and improve what they do provide, the information provided to the system.
One comment here from Suzanne. What do you say to a vendor that doesn't require a VPAT because of industry secret in quotations? So my standard feedback always was to a vendor, there's nothing in a VPAT or ACR that should be confidential. If that type of information is in there, you need to remove it. The other thing, there's no trade secrets. There's nothing that they're selling a product commercially. There's nothing that anyone couldn't discover about it on their own. There's nothing trade secret that should be in that document about its level of accessibility. The other thing is, if you're doing, say, an RFP or something like that, you make it a requirement in the RFP. You don't provide it, you don't play. You're out. You're not even considered. So I normally took a hard line in all of my dealings with that. I just wouldn't accept it. And vendors that wanted us to sign an NDA, I just said no. I didn't always get my way, but that was the line that I normally took.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom, for this presentation. And thank you, Dawn, for chiming in as well.